welcome to the craft room. In today's video, I'm going to show you how you can use your simply pressed clay to create some beautiful roses and leaves. So let's get started. For this project, you're going to need a couple balls of the simply pressed clay. I've made a ball here about a size of a quarter and one that's about the size of a dime. I'm going to set this one aside. We're going to be using this one for the leaves and I don't want it to dry out. So I'm going to set this aside for later and we'll go ahead and get started on our rose. So the first thing we're going to do is color our clay so that it's easier to see and also gives our rose a little bit of color. And I'm just going to grab a little plastic glove here so that I don't get ink all over my fingers. And I'm also going to grab my rose red re-inker and I'm just going to add a couple drops of re-inker directly into my clay, and then I'm just going to fold that onto itself and then start to incorporate the ink right into the clay. And you can see now why I'm wearing gloves for these purposes, because this is quite messy. If you don't mind getting ink on your fingers, then you don't need to use the glove, but I like to use it just so I don't have to run to the sink to wash off. Once we've incorporated the color into the clay, we're going to roll the clay into a ball, and then we're going to take the clay and create a tube, or some people call it a snake or a log. And so we're just rolling the clay back and forth to try to create this long tube-like shape. And why we're doing this is we're going to want to cut some equal pieces. We want to make this tube into equal pieces, and so having it in this shape helps us do that. So this tube now is about 3 inches long, and we're going to take a craft blade or hobby knife. You could also do this with a plastic knife as long as you don't then use the plastic knife for food purposes. And we're just going to cut this into 8 even pieces. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we now have 8 little pillows of clay, and we're going to pull those apart to separate them. And what's important now is that your clay doesn't touch, because your clay does have a tendency to want to stick to one another, and it can be very difficult to separate them apart once they touch. So starting now, you don't want to have your different pieces touch together. So for each of these 8 pieces now, we're actually going to roll the piece into a little ball. And let me move these out of the way, because the next thing we're going to do is flatten this into a disc. And you can do this here on your work surface, on your table, or on a craft sheet. You could also do it in your hands. I don't recommend you do this on paper because the clay does have a tendency to want to stick. So all we're doing is flattening this clay, hopefully you can see how thin that is, into circular shapes, and we're going to do this with all 8 of the pieces. I'm going to do that and I'll be right back. So I'm now flattening my 8th disc here, and again, these don't have to be perfectly round. We are making petals, so if they're a little imperfect, that actually will look really nice. You can also vary the number of petals that you make, so I like to go with 8 pieces. You could do this with 7 or 9 or 6. It just depends on the look that you're going for. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take one of these pieces, and I'm going to hold it up this way, hopefully so you can see, and I'm going to start to just roll in from the side here. And I don't want to squeeze too terribly tight because I don't want to squish the inside of my flower, but what we're forming here is the center part of our flower. And then once we have that spiral done, what you're going to do is just take your finger and very gently kind of roll back the edges of that center. So again, just being very gentle here. So I've got that rolling a little bit. Now we're going to take one of the next petals, and you'll see that you've created a bit of a seam here. So we're going to be working over that seam. So you just want to overlap a little bit. You also want to try to line up the top of your circle with the top of your flower. So I'm just doing a little bit of an overlap. I'm trying to make sure that those edges are at around the same place, and then I'm gently rolling that petal around the inside part that we've already created. And then once again, I'm just taking my finger and I'm rolling back that petal just a little bit. And now you'll see you have another seam, so we're going to go ahead and take our next petal. We're going to once again try to line up the top, overlap a little and roll, and then go ahead and use our finger to gently roll down that edge. And we're going to keep doing this for all of the petals that we've created. Again, you don't want to squeeze too tightly because you don't want to smush your flower, but you just want to keep rolling back the edges, working over the prior seam you've just created, and trying to line up the top edge of your petal with the rest of the flower that you've created. So you're going around and around the entire time. So again, overlapping a little bit and pressing that in place and rolling that petal back. And I've got 2 more to go now, so we've got this 7th one, adding that and rolling it back, and then finally our 8th petal, overlapping, putting it on there, and then rolling back that petal. So you can see now we have a really pretty completed rose. The one thing that I don't like about it is how thick it is, because if we tried to put this on a card or a project, it would really stand quite high or tall off of the surface of that project. So I'm going to want to cut this rose down. But right now the rose is very soft. You can see if I just press here, it's a very, very soft rose, and if I start pressing on the petal part, we're probably going to damage or distort the rose. So what I like to do is take my rose and actually put it in the freezer for about 10 minutes or so that it has an opportunity to harden before we go ahead and cut it down. So I'm going to go and do that, and while this is hardening, we'll go ahead and make some leaves. So I've grabbed this smaller ball of clay that we're going to use for the leaves, and I also have grabbed a glove, and you can already tell there was a little bit of green ink on the glove because it's already getting onto the clay. I'm just going to take some gumball green ink, and I'm going to drop a few drops into this clay just to give it that green leafy color, and I'm just going to incorporate it, and then we'll get started. So now I have my ball of gumball green clay, and this is probably large enough to make 3 or 4 leaves. So I'm actually going to roll this one out into a log as well, and I'm going to cut it into some even pieces. This doesn't matter as much for these purposes since your leaves can be different sizes without a problem, but I'm just going to cut that into 4 equal parts, and let's play with one of them to try to make our leaf. So what we're going to do is roll that little piece into first a circle shape, and then what we're going to do is make it a little bit oblong, so almost like an egg. And then I'm just going to press this in between my fingers, flattening it out. And this is going to be a relatively large leaf for our purposes so that you can see it, and you might want to work a little bit smaller than this depending on the size of your flower. And then all I'm going to do is pinch the end while I'm lifting up the edges, because that creates that really nice leaf shape that we can then use alongside our rose. So you can see that, a rose that I created earlier. The other thing that I like to do with my leaves is give them veins. So I like to take my paper piercing tool, and I'm going to work using this rounded part of the tool. And all I like to do is press down and indent very gently, because your clay is delicate and it's also still wet. And then I like to come in and make some little leaf veins going diagonally. And then I just set that aside to dry. So let me show you that one more time with a little bit of a smaller piece, so you can see one that's a little daintier. So we're just rolling it into a little ball and then into a little bit of an egg shape, and then we're going to press it down with our fingers, and then I'm going to lift and pinch the edge. So very delicately, very gently. And then once I've created that, I'm just going to come in with my paper piercing tool, and I'm going to make a little indent, and then I'm going to go ahead and just make my little vein lines using my paper piercing tool. And these just need to be set aside to air dry, and then they'll be ready to go. And now I've grabbed our rose from the freezer. You can tell when I press it, it's not as squishy or malleable because it's a little frozen, which is great because this now gives us an opportunity to cut down the rose. I'm just going to take my paper snips and go about 2/3 of the way up, since that's kind of the height of the rose that I like to use on my projects. I'm not going to push down on this part of the rose just because it is still delicate. It hasn't air dried yet, and I'm just going to snip down. So what that does is it creates a really nice flat back that you can then use to mount your rose on your projects. This rose will come to room temperature, and it is not yet air dried, so you have to be careful with it as it comes to room temperature because it will be really delicate. It will also be quite sticky or tacky, so you want to make sure that other pieces of clay don't come in contact with it. This extra end that you have, this will also come back to room temperature, and then you could go ahead and reuse this piece to make another flower. So there you have it, a really fun way to use your simply pressed clay to create some beautiful roses and leaves for your projects. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon here in the craft room.